Contracts can be complicated and confusing, so let's talk a little today about what to look for in a contract. As the Vice Chair for Private Language Industries, which mostly means Eikaiwa, I specialize in language schools, but I'll be talking generally today. We'll talk today about different kinds of contracts, minimum legal requirements and benefits, things to watch out for before or after you sign, and the process of working for a company from contract signing to the end of employment. To start, there are three kinds of contracts. The most common for foreign workers is a contract worker, or dodo keyaku. Although they're actually in the minority for total contracts in Japan, there are more and more workers on annual contracts every year. The second contract that we commonly see is the freelance contract, or gyomu itaku. And up front, if you're working part-time or more for the same company, you should not be on one of these contracts. The third type, which is most common for workers in Japan but less common for foreign workers, is the regular worker or seishain contract. There are seishain options for foreigners in some industries, especially in tech, but in education it's quite rare for a worker to have a seishain contract. A contract worker usually has a contract for 1 year, but they might be more or less. Looking at recent job postings, I've seen them for as little as 3 months and as many as 18, though I have seen them for even single-day jobs and for as long as 3 years. They're usually renewable contracts and may be for full-time or part-time workers. A lot of people worry about whether or not they'll be able to continue at their job as a contract worker. What happens when you reach the end of the contract? That's something we'll talk about a little bit more later. But a company can choose not to give you a second or third or fourth contract. If you aren't renewed in the first or second year, there isn't really much that can be done. They don't need to give you a reason. Your contract is finished, and your responsibility to each other has ended. However, from the third year of continuous employment, you're basically guaranteed a renewal. Your rights to employment get a little stronger, and the company has to give you a reason for not renewing. This might come down to we're downsizing, but they still have to give you some sort of reason why. In your 6th year, you'll have the option to strengthen your employment even more, and you'll be able to convert from renewing a contract to one with an unlimited term. This means that the company can't just decide not to renew your contract. The only way to end your relationship is to be fired or for you to quit. We'll talk more about those things later too. If you're working at university, there are some cases where you have to be working for 10 years. I believe this applies to people in research positions, but some universities have tried to force this rule on regular teachers too. So please be aware of this if you work at universities. And if you think you should be eligible for an unlimited term contract, please get in touch and request a consultation. Freelance workers are legitimate contracts that serve an important purpose. You agree to provide a company with a product or service within a set amount of time. They're designed for short-term outsourced work and can occur between companies, between individuals, or between an individual and a company, as is the most common case that I deal with. A problem with freelancing is that you're legally employed by yourself, so your rights are a lot more limited. You're not entitled to a lot of the same things by the employer as a contract or regular worker might be, such as health insurance and pension insurance. Due to the nature of this contract, it's not a great option for people on limited visas because it could lead to a shorter renewal period, 1 year as opposed to 3 or even 5 received by workers on more consistent contracts. If you've got your eye on permanent residency, avoid itaku contracts being your primary source of income. Another thing to remember is, with this kind of contract, it's not really meant for long-term or regular employment. If you're working 20 or more hours per week at your company, you should probably not be on an itaku contract. Get in touch with us for a consultation if you're concerned about your employment status. The gold standard of contracts is this one, the seishain or regular worker contract. They're always full-time, and for these workers, the contract term is indefinite from day one. Wages do tend to be a little lower, but you're buying into the company in a sense. As a regular worker, you may be entitled to benefits that contract workers just aren't, such as annual or even quarterly bonuses and retirement pay. Now, retirement pay and end-of-contract bonuses are different things entirely. First of all, it's common that you won't receive any retirement pay if you leave the company within 3 to 5 years. Second, retirement pay stacks, meaning that it increases the longer you work. As an example, a former coworker of mine left after 5 years of working at our company with a solid 6 months worth of salary as a retirement bonus. Now, consider someone who spends their entire life at a company. They'll retire with years of salary and retirement bonus, actual millions of yen, on top of a good monthly pension thanks to required enrollment in Shakai Hoken. One thing to keep in mind for sayshine is that it's not a legal term. So if you're looking for legal technicalities on these kinds of positions, pretty much anything that applies to contract workers also applies to sayshine under the Labor Standards Act. Speaking of which, let's discuss some of the basic legal requirements and benefits that you might see on your contract. Labor Standards Act Article 15 states, when entering into a labor contract, the employer must make the wages, working hours, and other working conditions explicit to the worker. What this means is, at the bare minimum, a contract has to answer these questions. First, who's making the contract? This is referring to you and the owner of a company. If you look at your contract, especially if you work for a larger organization, your branch manager will not be the person whose signature is next to yours on the contract. This is important to remember when you have a problem, because there are a lot of times that your direct manager has no idea what is on your contract. So if you have an employment or contract-related problem, they are usually not the person to ask. However, if they ask or try to make you do something outside the bounds of your contract, it's likely that they just don't know better, assuming that your contract and theirs have similar tasks. Another important question is, where are you working? This specifically refers to the company you're working for, but usually the physical location is also included. There are some places that will not explicitly state the workplace because it might change for whatever reason throughout the year, but it should explicitly state in which workplaces or general areas you'll be expected to travel. Your contract should also tell you your hours or when you're working. Like the workplace, this may not be explicit. If you work part-time, for example, or in a location where shifts or schedules fluctuate from month to month, it is legal for the company to simply state the hours between which you are expected to work. If it lists something like 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., there should also be a description of the number of hours you're expected to be working, like 7 hours break inclusive between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. The last and most important is, what are you making? Whether this is monthly, daily, or hourly, your base wage rate must be written on the contract. If you were promised any sort of bonuses, make sure these are listed too. If there's no contractual promise to pay out a bonus, you can't be guaranteed to get it. So if they tell you during the interview process that bonuses are given, make sure that your final contract includes mention of that too. But something to remember is that bonuses are an added benefit of employment. There are a lot of different kinds of benefits that you might get on your contract. Some of them, paid leave, break times, and overtime pay, are required by law and are the bare minimum that a company can offer. I want to specially touch on paid leave here. You might know that the Labor Standards Act guarantees workers up to 10 days of paid leave per year, depending on how long they've been working. However, it does not guarantee these days are free to use. In 2019, labor law was amended to allow the company to preset all but 5 of these days. This was to ensure that workers were actually using their annual paid leave. These are all benefits that are required by law, meaning that they are the bare minimum that the company can offer. Anything better than this, or any of these benefits on the right, are things that are not required by law. Things like bonuses, yes, transportation reimbursement, and corporate benefits like stock options and discount programs are not legally required and are things that union members or even individuals can bargain for. If your company offers to you any of the items on the right, especially as a contract worker, I consider it something of a green flag. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a great company or that there aren't things that could be better, but it is a sign that the company cares about its workers to some degree. That said, there are some red flags that I'd like to address today and encourage you to watch out for. One thing I'd like to highlight before we get started is that there are a lot of small businesses who create contracts that might not be well informed about labor law. They might have had a contract looked at by a lawyer, but sometimes that lawyer might not have a background in labor and miss some points. Or maybe the contract is written in English and never translated into Japanese, which makes things more difficult for everybody. The things I'll talk about here don't necessarily mean a company is bad, but it does mean that you might encounter some problems along the line related to the terms of your employment if you see these things. The first is if the company doesn't meet the minimum requirements we just talked about. These are your basic rights under the law, and the company cannot hold you to the terms of that contract. However, there might be pushback, and in that case, it's something that might require the intervention of the union or the Labor Bureau. Another red flag is employment insurance. This is cheap, usually less than 1,500 yen per month, and it's something that all full-time workers should be enrolled in. It guarantees you certain financial support, such as payment in case of long-term illness, childcare leave, and even unemployment benefits when you quit or lose your job. If you're a part-time worker working over 20 hours per week for over a month, it's something available to you too. But this is not something that freelancers are eligible for, which is all the more reason to make sure you're not freelancing part-time for the same company when you could be receiving these kinds of benefits. Relatedly, if you're not enrolled in company health insurance and pension, or Shakai Hoken, that's a red flag, especially if you're working full-time. If you're a part-timer, the company isn't required to enroll you, unless you're working 20 hours or more at a medium or large business with over 50 employees, or unless you work 30 or more hours per week. However, there are a lot of benefits to Shakai Hoken that you should be aware of. For one thing, your insurance payments are a little bit lower on Shakai Hoken than they are on national health insurance and pension because the company is required to pay half. Benefits are usually better. There are some things covered under company health insurance that may not be covered under national health insurance, such as acupuncture therapy or certain dentists. Under company pension, your payout on retirement will be better too, which makes up for a little bit of the lack of retirement bonus for contract workers. A big red flag that we sometimes see is a company trying to charge you a fine if you're absent or want to quit. Fines like these are not legal, so they're not something to worry about, but you might want to consider why they would list something on their contracts like this in the first place. Have they had a lot of workers leave suddenly? Are they perhaps biased against foreign workers and assume we'll want to take off time regularly? Either way, it's important to think about whether there might be a reason for that, or if it's the kind of atmosphere you want to subject yourself to. One thing that isn't illegal, though, is suing for damages. If you quit suddenly, a company may attempt to do this, but you should know that it's very rare. One of our senior staff often tells workers that in his 20-plus years of union work, he's seen this happen exactly twice. One final thing to watch out for is fixed overtime or excessive expected overtime at a company. Fixed overtime, especially for incidental work, is not in theory a bad idea. However, it can affect your bottom line and is something the union is generally against. Just because the company may say the rate is for incidental overtime, that extra 5 to 10 minutes before or at the end of your workday, doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be enforced that way, and you might be required to come in earlier or stay later than your contract states you have to. Expected overtime is not illegal, but consider how many hours they're asking. At my former company, our incidental overtime was 10 hours a month, about 30 minutes per day. Break down what the expected overtime on your contract is. Basically, anything more than 20 hours per month, you might want to consider how much you like working and how much your personal time means to you before signing, especially if you have a long commute. One final thing that I want you guys to watch out for are bait-and-switch style contract concerns. If a company offers you a full-time job and it's actually an Itaku contract, that's a red flag. If you're given a limited-term contract during your probation period and promised to be promoted to Seishain after, that's a red flag. This is a little softer, though, because it is a fairly common strategy in some industries. However, make sure to stay up on the terms of your probation. That's something we'll talk about more in a few minutes. A really important one for me, though, is the consideration for base salary. If you're offered 250,000 yen per month, it should be 250,000 yen per month. They might take it back and say, but 20,000 yen of that is fixed overtime or an attendance bonus, and then another 1,000 yen per blog post or something. And at the end of the day, that means that your salary isn't actually 250,000 yen a month. This is a problem because some benefits, such as unemployment, are dependent on your base salary. It also feels a bit like a slap in the face. In 2018, my company introduced a 20,000 yen fixed overtime rate to all foreign workers, but they did this by reducing our base salary by 15,000. They tried to make it sound good by saying we'd be getting a 5,000 yen raise, essentially, but I refused to sign off on this. It was the principle of the thing. Basically, they were telling me I was worth 15,000 yen less to them today than I was yesterday, and I told my head trainer that directly. Basically, don't take 20,000 as a bonus when another company will give it to you as part of your base wage. A company might also contract and schedule your hours differently. This is, of course, illegal, but they might try to make it sound appealing by showing that the cost of your insurance and pension payments are lower, for example. Well, they'll be lower for the company too, and they're trying to get you to sign an illegal contract. Be careful of these red flags, and if you have a concern about any of them, don't forget that you can request a consultation from General Union anytime. So let's talk a little about what the annual contract timeline looks like. This is going from a teacher's perspective, so if you're in a different industry, your timeline might look a little different. Just shift the months a little bit. In February, you might sign the contract. Make sure to look for those red flags we mentioned and check that your benefits meet the legal minimums. In April, you might start working, possibly on probation, which might be about 3 months, putting the end of your probation at the end of June. Congratulations, you're now a full employee, albeit for the next 9 months. But in this industry, the renewal period starts early. Come September, your boss might already be asking if you're planning to continue, giving performance reviews, giving feedback. If you're interested in continuing and they like working with you, hopefully you'll be offered a new contract around December. You should be given a little time to consider, usually around 2 weeks. And once you sign, the cycle starts again, though without the probation period. I'd like to talk a little about probation periods because there is some confusion about them and it can sometimes feel a little negative to be told you'll be on probation from day one. The most important thing to know is that they are legal and valid for a little while. They're usually about 1 to 3 months, and if the company sees a need, they may legally extend them. The upper limit caps out at about 6 months, and anything more than that would be considered unreasonably long. But probation periods are a good thing for both the worker and the company because it helps you know whether or not the job actually suits you. If you don't like it, or if the company doesn't think you mesh, amicable, no questions asked separation is no problem. But again, it's important to remember that anything more than 6 months on probation is unreasonably long, especially as most contracts are for 1 year. At that point, the company knows whether or not they'll fire or renew you and should just make a commitment to that. But firing doesn't happen that easily, even on probation. You can be let go at any point in the first 14 days for any reason and just be told not to come in the next day. It's not so easy for the company after that. They must legally give you 30 days notice or payment in lieu. That is 14 calendar days and 30 calendar days, not business days. So once you get past those first 2 weeks, you can breathe a little easier. Once you make it past probation, you can look forward to the end of your contract. There are a lot of things that can happen here, so let's take a look at a few of them. First, let's talk about a few positive instances. The ideal situation is renewal. Congratulations, you were offered a new contract. We talked before about the renewal period for teachers being pretty early, but the renewal period in reality might start 6 months out, or you might be handed a new contract just a few hours before your old one expires. The most important thing is that a verbal agreement is made to continue working. You might even receive a physical contract after your old one expires for you to sign retroactively, and that's fine too. One thing that has a little bit of a gray area is whether or not you even receive a verbal agreement before the end of contract occurs, but you continue working anyway. I don't think there's a legal limit on this explicitly, but please know that at some point you are effectively considered to be on an unlimited term contract. You'll be there as long as you want. Remember that unlimited term contracts just remove the term limit from your work period. If you're on regularly renewing contracts, you're eligible from the 6th year of employment, not the 6th contract, the 6th year. It's important to know, though, that a 6-month break restarts that clock. If you leave and come back, you can't continue on your path to unlimited term contracts unless it's within that first 6 months. Companies have in the past asked workers to leave after 5 years, saying you can come back in 6 months or you can reapply in a year, but that's another red flag to be aware of. The 3 less than positive end of employment options are resignation, termination, and non-renewal. Of the 3, resignation is the best because it does end on your terms. If you resign because you want to leave, it's generally advised to follow the terms of your resignation as they're listed on your contract. This can be a little extreme at 3 or even 6 months, but from that 2nd year, you're really free to resign whenever you want. We do generally advise some notice, though. 2 weeks is kind of the international standard, and it's what we tend to recommend. Another key point, though, is that you shouldn't pay any fees to the company when you quit. This is along the lines of the fines red flag that was talked about earlier. A company can also ask you to resign. There are a lot of reasons for this. It's more amicable of a separation, you're leaving on your own terms still, technically, and you can have no worries about listing the company on your resume, since the only thing they can really say about your tenure is that you worked there, and the dates. But if they ask you to resign and you refuse, that turns into termination. Again, a company can choose to fire you for any reason within the first 14 days. That's with or without a probation period. But after that first 14 days, you're entitled to 30 days notice or 30 days payment. Companies don't like to fire people for a lot of reasons, not least of which is they have to provide a reason for the firing. And it often doesn't look good for them either. A little bit easier for the company is to simply not renew the contract, which they have every right to do. They do still need to give at least 30 days notice of non-renewal since it's basically termination. And in the first 2 years, they don't need to give you a reason, unfortunately. In that third year, though, they do need to start giving a concrete reason for not renewing your contract. Your rights get stronger, and this helps prevent companies from dodging the 5-year rule for UTC enrollment, too. One last thing I want to talk about today is how to negotiate. Sometimes there are things you don't like on your contract, and you want to change them before you sign. If the overall contract is good, you should probably just sign it, even if you disagree with some terms, because the union can support your changing them. But we can't do that if you're not actually working there. It's always okay to ask for a change on your contract, requesting slightly higher salary or that the bonus is written in explicitly, for example, are perfectly fine. But the company also has a right to say no, and in that case, it's better not to push unless you've basically got 2 identical job offers. Pushing for contract changes can lead to a contract being reneged or put a target on your back for later down the line. The last thing I'd like to say today is that change starts with you. If you like your workplace but think things could be better, talk to us. We can work together to ensure long-term employment and improve benefits for everyone in the workplace. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please visit us at generalunion.org/consultations, or if you're a member, please reach out to your branch chair. Bye!